The human body produces oil, sweat, dead skin, and waste every single day. In the modern world, this is managed through an infrastructure most people never think about: running water, soap, toilets, sewage systems, and industrial sanitation. Remove that infrastructure, and the problem becomes immediate. Skin begins to itch. Odor intensifies. Bacteria multiply in the folds of clothing and the creases of skin. Waste accumulates. Infection becomes more likely. Disease spreads faster. For most of human history, none of the tools we depend on existed. No soap factories, no plumbing, no sewage treatment plants. And yet, people survived. Not just survived, but built civilizations, raised children, maintained social structures, and passed on knowledge across generations. They did this without understanding germ theory, without access to chemicals, and without the luxury of privacy or convenience. The question is not whether ancient humans stayed clean. The question is how they managed a constant biological problem with limited resources, and what happened when they failed.
A modern person placed into a pre-industrial environment would struggle almost immediately. The instinct to wash hands after touching something dirty is trained into most people from childhood, but that instinct depends on the presence of clean water, soap, and a drain to carry waste away. In a world where water must be carried by hand, where soap does not exist, and where waste has nowhere to go except the ground, the simple act of staying clean becomes a complex negotiation between effort, resources, and risk. The body does not stop producing oil. Sweat does not stop forming. Dead skin does not stop shedding. These processes are constant, and in a hot climate or during physical labor, they intensify. Without a way to manage them, the skin becomes a breeding ground for bacteria and fungi. Clothing becomes stiff with dried sweat and oil. Hair mats and tangles. Wounds become infected. The mouth develops plaque and teeth decay. Waste, if not managed, contaminates water sources and spreads parasites. The modern person, stripped of their infrastructure, would face all of this within days.
Water was the foundation of all cleaning, but access to water was never guaranteed. Rivers, springs, and lakes provided natural sources, but they were also shared with animals, exposed to contamination, and sometimes dangerous to approach. Communities settled near water not just for drinking, but because proximity made daily washing possible. In dry regions, water was rationed carefully, and cleaning became a question of priority. The body was washed, but not always fully. Hands and face received the most attention because they came into contact with food and were visible to others. Feet were washed when possible, especially in cultures where shoes were rare or poorly constructed. The rest of the body was cleaned less frequently, depending on labor, climate, and access to water. This was not neglect, it was adaptation. The human body produces oils that protect the skin. Overwashing, especially with harsh methods, can strip these oils and cause irritation. Ancient humans, through trial and error, found a balance between removing harmful buildup and maintaining the skin's natural defenses. When water was scarce, other materials were used. Sand and fine gravel acted as abrasives to scrub away dead skin and oil. In desert cultures, people rubbed their skin with sand before rinsing with small amounts of water. This method was effective because the physical action removed the outer layer of grime without requiring large volumes of water. Ash from fires, particularly wood ash, was mixed with water to create a slippery substance. This was not soap, but it had similar properties. Wood ash contains potassium compounds that react with oils to break them down, making them easier to rinse away. The mixture was harsh, and repeated use could damage skin, but it worked. Oils and fats from animals and plants were also used, not to clean, but to protect. After washing with water or ash, people would sometimes rub oil into their skin to prevent drying and cracking.
This was especially important in cold climates, where dry skin could split and become infected. The oil also acted as a barrier against dirt and insects, though it carried its own odor and attracted dust. These methods were not pleasant by modern standards, but they addressed the immediate problem, reducing the buildup of material that caused discomfort and disease.
Clothing presented a different challenge. Fabric absorbs sweat, oil, and dirt, and without soap or hot water, it is difficult to clean thoroughly. Ancient clothing was often made from wool, linen, leather, or plant fibers, all of which required different care. Wool could be beaten and aired to remove some dirt and odor. Linen could be soaked in water and scrubbed against rocks. Leather, once stiff with sweat and oil, was difficult to restore and was often replaced rather than cleaned. In some cultures, clothing was washed infrequently, and people relied on changing garments rather than cleaning them. Those who could afford it owned multiple tunics or robes and rotated them, allowing each to air out between uses. Those who could not afford multiple garments wore the same clothing for weeks or months, and the smell became part of daily life. Urine was sometimes used to clean wool because the ammonia helped break down oils and set dyes. Fullers, workers who processed wool, would collect urine from public latrines and use it in large vats to treat fabric. The process was effective, but it was also considered degrading work, and fullers occupied a low social position in many societies. This reveals something important. Cleaning was labor-intensive, unpleasant, and often assigned to those with the least power.
Hair required constant attention. Without shampoo or conditioner, hair became oily and matted quickly, especially in dusty or smoky environments. People used water to rinse their hair, but this alone was not enough to remove buildup. Combs made from bone, wood, or metal were used to untangle hair and remove lice, which were a constant problem. Lice spread easily in close quarters, and once established, they were difficult to eliminate. Some cultures used oils or animal fats to smother lice, then combed them out. Others shaved their heads entirely, especially in hot climates or during outbreaks of infestation. Beards and body hair were trimmed or removed depending on cultural norms. In ancient Egypt, both men and women often shaved their heads and wore wigs, partly for cleanliness and partly for fashion. The wigs could be washed and treated separately from the body, reducing the problem of lice and oil buildup. In colder climates, hair was kept long for warmth, and people tolerated the inconvenience. Teeth were cleaned with twigs, cloth, or fingers. Some cultures chewed fibrous plants that acted as natural brushes. Others used abrasive powders made from crushed shells or charcoal. These methods were crude, but they reduced plaque and prevented some decay. Dental health was generally poor, and tooth loss was common by middle age.
Human waste posed the greatest risk. Feces and urine carry bacteria and parasites that spread disease rapidly, especially in communities where people lived close together. Without toilets or sewage systems, waste had to be managed manually. In many early societies, people simply walked to the edge of a settlement to relieve themselves. This worked when populations were small and land was abundant, but as villages grew into towns, the accumulation of waste became a health crisis. Some cultures dug pits and covered waste with soil. Others collected waste in containers and emptied them at designated sites outside the settlement. In ancient Rome, public latrines were built over channels that carried waste into rivers or cesspits. These latrines were not private. People sat side by side on stone benches with holes, and waste dropped into a flowing channel below. There was no toilet paper. People used sponges on sticks, which were rinsed in the channel between uses and shared. The system worked in the sense that it moved waste away from living areas, but it did not eliminate contamination. The channels often emptied into water sources downstream, spreading illness to other communities. Roman cities also employed workers to collect human waste from homes and carry it out in buckets. This waste was sometimes sold to farmers as fertilizer, but the work was dangerous and despised.
Those who did it were exposed to parasites and disease, and many died young. In medieval European cities, waste was often thrown into the streets from upper-story windows. The streets became rivers of filth, especially during rain. Animals wandered through waste, children played near it. Disease was constant, the smell was overwhelming, and those who could afford it used perfumes and pomanders filled with aromatic herbs to mask the odor. But masking the smell did nothing to address the underlying problem. Waste attracted rats and flies, which carried disease. Wells were contaminated by seepage from cesspits. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid killed thousands. The connection between waste and disease was not understood for centuries, and even when patterns were noticed, infrastructure was slow to develop. Building sewage systems required labor, resources, and coordination, and many cities simply lacked the capacity or the will to do it.
Bathing, when possible, was a social and practical activity. In cultures with access to rivers or lakes, people bathed communally, often at specific times of day. Men and women bathed separately in most societies, though the rules varied. Water was cold more often than not, and bathing in winter was avoided unless absolutely necessary. In warmer climates, bathing was more frequent, and some cultures developed elaborate rituals around it. The Greeks and Romans built bathhouses, large public facilities with heated water and rooms of varying temperatures. These were not just places to wash, they were social centers where people gathered to talk, conduct business, and relax. Entry was cheap, and even the poor could afford to visit. Inside, bathers moved through a series of rooms. The first was warm, to open the pores. The second was hot, often filled with steam. The third was cold, to close the pores and invigorate the body. Oils were applied to the skin and then scraped off with a curved metal tool called a strigil, removing dirt and dead skin in the process.
The bathhouse system was effective, but it also required infrastructure. Aqueducts to supply water, furnaces to heat it, and workers to maintain the facilities. When the Roman Empire collapsed, the bathhouses fell into disrepair, and public bathing largely disappeared from Europe for centuries. Without the infrastructure, people returned to simpler methods, and hygiene standards declined. In other parts of the world, bathing traditions persisted. In Japan, communal hot springs and bathhouses remained central to daily life. In the Islamic world, hammams served a similar function, providing not just a place to wash, but a space for social interaction and religious preparation. These bathhouses were often built near mosques, and washing before prayer was both a religious obligation and a practical hygiene measure. The persistence of bathing culture in these regions was not accidental. It was supported by infrastructure, religious law, and social norms that reinforced the importance of cleanliness.
Cultural norms reinforced hygiene practices, even when the reasons were not fully understood. In many societies, cleanliness was tied to religious or social respectability. The ability to appear clean signaled status and self-control. Those who were visibly dirty were often excluded from certain spaces or treated with suspicion. Religious texts from multiple traditions contain instructions on washing before prayer, after contact with the dead, and before preparing food. These rules were not arbitrary. They reflected an intuitive understanding that certain practices reduced illness, even if the underlying biology was unknown. Menstruation was treated as a time of impurity in many cultures, and menstruating women were isolated or required to undergo specific washing rituals before rejoining the community. This was partly social control, but it also addressed the practical problem of managing blood and odor without modern sanitary products. Women used cloth, wool, or plant fibers to absorb menstrual blood, and these materials were washed and reused. The process was private and rarely discussed, but it was a constant part of life. The enforcement of hygiene norms varied widely. In some cultures, public shaming was used to pressure people into washing more frequently.
In others, laws were passed requiring certain standards of cleanliness, though enforcement was difficult. In medieval European cities, guilds and trades sometimes imposed hygiene requirements on their members, not out of compassion, but because visible filth damaged the reputation of the trade. Barbers, for example, were expected to keep their tools and workspaces clean because their clients were often wealthy and would take their business elsewhere if conditions were poor. Butchers and tanners, whose work involved blood and animal parts, were often required to work outside city walls because of the smell and the attraction of flies. These regulations reveal an understanding that certain activities created health risks, even if the mechanisms were not understood. The problem was that enforcement was inconsistent, and those with wealth or power could often avoid the rules that applied to everyone else.
When hygiene systems broke down, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Plagues and epidemics swept through communities with terrifying speed, killing large portions of the population. The Black Death, which killed tens of millions in the 14th century, spread partly because of poor sanitation and crowded living conditions. Waste accumulated in streets. Rats thrived. Fleas carried bacteria from rats to humans. Once infection took hold, there was no effective treatment, and fear drove people to irrational behaviors. Some believed the plague was caused by bad air and tried to fumigate homes with strong-smelling herbs. Others blamed marginalized groups and carried out violence. The real cause, bacteria transmitted through flea bites and respiratory droplets, was not understood until centuries later. Cholera outbreaks, caused by contaminated water, killed thousands in cities where human waste seeped into drinking supplies. Dysentery, typhoid, and parasitic infections were endemic in areas with poor sanitation. Children were especially vulnerable, and infant mortality was high. In some historical periods, half of all children died before the age of 5, many from diseases that are now easily preventable. The lack of hygiene infrastructure did not just cause discomfort, it shaped mortality rates, life expectancy, and the structure of societies. Populations that developed effective waste management and bathing systems grew larger and more stable. Those that did not remained small, vulnerable, and prone to sudden collapse. The connection between hygiene and survival was clear, even if the specific mechanisms were not. Ancient humans were not ignorant. They observed patterns and adapted their behavior accordingly. They noticed that people who bathed regularly were less likely to develop certain rashes and sores. They noticed that covering waste reduced the smell and the number of flies. They noticed that communities near clean water sources were healthier than those near stagnant pools. They built systems based on these observations, even without understanding the mechanisms. Some of these systems were remarkably sophisticated. The Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished over 4,000 years ago, had planned cities with advanced drainage systems. Homes were connected to covered drains that carried waste away from living areas. Public baths were built with changing rooms and heated water. The technology was lost when the civilization collapsed, and later cultures had to rediscover similar solutions independently. The story of how humans stayed clean without soap or bathrooms is not a story of primitive ignorance overcome by modern progress. It is a story of continuous adaptation, trial and error, and the transfer of knowledge across generations. Ancient humans solved the problem of hygiene within the limits of their environment and technology. They developed methods that were effective enough to allow survival and reproduction, even if those methods were uncomfortable, labor-intensive, and sometimes dangerous. The consequences of failure were visible and immediate, which created a powerful incentive to maintain whatever systems worked. The modern world has largely solved the problem of hygiene, but only through constant effort and energy. Water must be purified and pumped. Sewage must be treated and disposed of. Soap and cleaning products must be manufactured and distributed. None of this happens automatically, and all of it depends on a functioning economy and government. In places where infrastructure breaks down, whether through war, natural disaster, or economic collapse, the old problems return quickly.
cholera reappears, skin infections spread, waste contaminates water. People adapt as best they can, using the same methods their ancestors used thousands of years ago. The difference is that modern people have forgotten how to live without infrastructure. They have no practice rationing water, no experience washing without soap, no cultural memory of managing waste manually. This makes them more vulnerable, not less, when systems fail. The knowledge that allowed ancient humans to survive is not encoded in genes. It is passed down through teaching, observation, and repetition. When that chain of transmission is broken, the knowledge disappears, and people must relearn through painful trial and error. The fragility of hygiene infrastructure is a reminder that civilization is not a permanent state. It is a set of behaviors and systems that must be maintained continuously. When those systems are taken for granted, when the effort required to maintain them is forgotten, they become vulnerable to collapse. Ancient humans understood this intuitively. They knew that survival required constant vigilance, adaptation, and the willingness to do unpleasant work. That understanding, more than any specific technique, is what allowed them to stay clean enough to survive in a world without soap or bathrooms.